The attack by the Emperor's children was doing its job, drawing the concentration of the defenders. "Oh, they're good for something, at least," he murmured to himself. Decius had always thought the Third Legion to be more self-indulgent than the rest of the Astartes. A voice came back over the general channel, a single word loaded with the ready glee of battle. "Execute!" shouted Eidolon, and as one the Death Guards surged up from their concealment in a heavy wave of storm-grey armour. "Count the 7!" cried a voice, and Decius repeated the call, hearing it over and over down the line of advance. The men of the 14th Legion were done being quiet. The guards on the battlements were already red ruins, falling from their perches to shatter on the rock floor, gored by bolt shells sniped from the middle distance. Small-gauge missiles from man-portable launchers lanced out in a wave over Decius's head, converging on points in the wall where Auspex scans had discovered weaknesses. The Astartes saw motion at the foot of the barrier. There were self-contained bunker pods strung out there, each equipped with pintle-mounted lasers. Thread-thin lines of crimson blinked, joining the ovoid pods to running men. Burns scored across Ceramite, and a few unlucky ones caught a charge in the face, blinded by the beams. The defence did nothing to slow the Death Guard advance. Once their blood was up, it was simply impossible to halt them, the crushing infantry charge boiling over stone and broken sheets of gas ice, guns crashing out into the thin air. Decius gave a full clip of bolter rounds to the closest pod, and reloaded on the run, his pace never faltering. He heard a strangled cry issue out from the gunslit. The battle brother with the missile launcher was still with him, sporting the ugly singe mark from a glancing shot on his torso, but otherwise untouched. He saw the Astartes drop to one knee, and then, with the ammunition carousel chattering, the missileer released a 4-shot salvo at the bunker. The rockets hit in a perfect cluster and tore the pod open, the roof peeling back as a fireball forced its way out. Incredibly, figures in black stumbled from the smoking ruin, some of them on fire, all of them brandishing weapons. Decius fired from the hip, killing a handful, and stormed in to take the last survivor by hand. Decius punched the Isvanian squarely in the chest, and the power fist cannoned him back into the bricks of the shield wall. The enemy soldier fell from a ragged impact crater and dropped at Decius's feet, a boneless rag doll. A hissing sound reached his ears, and the Astartes crouched to investigate. The man had lost a Vox headset in the impact, and it lay on the dirt next to him. Decius gathered it up and listened. Strident noise came from it, a disharmony of raw screeching tones that clawed up and down the cords. He tossed it away and stood up again. Decius glanced around, seeing the other bunker pods all burning or shattered, then nudged the corpse with his boot. A face, bloated with new death, looked back up at him, one eye peering through the shattered red lens of an aiming reticule. "You won't be my last today," he told the dead man. "Fall back to a safe distance," Garrow's voice shouted. "Charges to detonate." The Astartes with the launcher tapped him on the shoulder. "Brother, come. They're going to blow the wall." Decius sprinted back a few hundred meters to where the Death Guard was massing in good order. He saw Tollin Sendek at his heels, a Sapper Command Signum unit in his grip. "Ready!" snapped Sendek. Garrow's helmet bobbed. "Do it." Sendek stabbed at a glowing key, and Decius heard a sharp, fizzing report from the stone fortification. Then, in the next second, tortured air molecules screamed aloud, and a great length of the stone wall became rubble and powder. "Take the dome!" Garrow drew his power sword and cut the air with it. "For Terra and Mortarion!" Decius ran at the battle captain's flank and plunged into the roiling clouds of rock dust, his helmet optics automatically rendering the terrain before him in grainy wire frames over the standard visual spectrum display. Sendek had, in defiance of conventional battlefield doctrine, used powerful hull-cutter charges designed for starship boarding actions, instead of standard crack munitions. The resultant overpressure from detonation in an atmosphere, even one as thin as that of Istvan Extremis, had blown down a large part of the west wall, and gone on to cut a bite from the central dome beyond it. Decius didn't need to look up to remember the form of the target facility. He had committed it to memory on the journey from the Endurance, fixing in his subconscious the shape of the oblate hemisphere and its forest of odd, pipe-like towers. His boots crunched on the bodies of dead men, pulped by the breaching charges. Lines of twisted metal rebar crowded in around the Astartes, with bits of dangling ferrocrete strung along them like dusty pearls. Garrow drew back his sword arm to cut through them, but Decius stepped in before him. "No, Lord! Allow me!" Decius struck out with the power fist and hammered it 4 times against the stone, the final blow clearing the last of the blockage before them. He grinned to himself. It wasn't every battle where a man would find himself punching a building. The Death Guard spilled through the breach and into the dome proper, figures in off-white armour filling up the space inside. Decius saw hooded figures in black swarming like maddened ants through the smoke and dust, and beyond them... He blinked, drinking in the sight of the peculiar structure that dominated the dome. The briefing had told the Astartes to expect a standard Imperial sensor platform, perhaps with some recent modifications, but nothing more. Decius imagined they would penetrate the dome and find banks of cogitators, wave monitors and the like. He could not have been more wrong. Every tier of the dome's inner levels had been removed, making the entire space wide open. In the middle of the smoke-wreathed chamber, there was a construct that seemed to be made of stone, but not the local variety of grey rock shot with mica. It was a rough-sided ziggurat, hewn from different slabs of minerals in a panoply of colours. The stones could only have come from other worlds, that was obvious. But why? What possible reason could there have been for something like this, in a place this remote, where no one but a few hundred traitors would ever see it? On the inside face of the dome, there were patterns of lines and discs that seemed to go on forever, baffling the eye with illusions of depth and movement where there was none. Then there was the light and the sound, the same discordant noise he had heard on the headset. It was coming from the apex of the construction, rolling down the steep sides of the pyramid in slow, punishing waves. There was a figure up there, floating. Red lasers stitched the air around Decius's head, tearing his attention away from the ziggurat and back to the battle at hand. The Death Guard force was large, but they had underestimated the number of turncoats clustering inside the main dome. He heard Raal's voice on the Vox, furious with tension. "Encountering heavy resistance at objective!" Decius slammed an enemy trooper to death, the blow sending the dead man into a ring of his comrades and in turn taking them off their feet. Captain Garrow sliced through the Istvanian lines, with Libertas shining with gore, the bolter in his other hand banging with each kill shot it released. Solon kept pace with his commander, gathering Raal and Sendek to him. Haker and his squad had the flanks as they pushed in towards the foot of the arcane construction. Decius laughed, the rush of the battle coursing through him, making a dozen more close-range kills with his bolter, blood flicking off his war gear. They were at the base of the ziggurat when a dull concussion rumbled through the dome, and a set of blast doors caved in with an agonized creak. Muscled giants in purple and gold punched through the entrance and laid into the Black Hoods. "Fulgrim's boys have decided to grace us with their presence," said Garrow, baring his teeth. "Let's not let Eidolon say he made the peak before the Death Guard." The moment of confusion in the defenders caused by the new arrivals was enough to give the men of the 7th the opening they needed, and swiftly the battle captain led the squad up the rough-hewn face of the pyramid. Decius's gaze ranged up the steep, peculiar little mountain and found the apex again. Yes, he saw it clearly now. A woman was up there, and by some means she hovered, suspended in a cowl of glitter. Light popped and writhed around her shimmering form, each tiny sun-bright flash accompanied by more sound, more shrieking, lethal noise that pounded into his eardrums. "Blood's oath!" he shouted, barely loud enough for his words to carry over the horrific dissonance. "What in the name of terror is she?" Garrow threw a look over his shoulder and spat out a name. "Warsinger." Chapter 6. Garrow stole a glance down the sheer slope of the ziggurat and saw the wild play of the battle spread out beneath him. All around the interior of the dome there was a churning sea of men engaged in the business of killing one another. Figures in black hoods swarmed at the white and purple shapes of the Astartes, laser fire flashing in chains of red lightning among the flares of yellow flame from bolter muzzles. Emperor's children were scaling the pyramid beneath them, following the path his men were forging with every heavy bootstep. Dust and stone fragments crackled with each footfall, the peculiar patchwork construct resonating with each tortured stanza of the war singer's song. Garrow pressed on, using the thick fingers of his gauntlets to dig handholds from the stonework and haul himself upward. He saw red granite, crumbly limestone, and strange chunks of bifurcated statuary as he climbed. The mess of bricks seemed to have no regularity in its design or purpose. They were close to the woman now, and the Astartes could vaguely sense voices on his vox, but the deafening operatic screams of the enemy champion flattened them under an indecipherable roar. The war singer was steady and unmoving, and strange etches of colour and light drifted around her, just as the lazy snowflakes had drifted out on the plains. She had her hands to her chest, her head back, throwing a keening dirge to the roof. The song was endless, without pause for breath or metre, each note locking to the next, cutting through Garrow's attempts to think clearly. It was unearthly. No human throat should have been able to voice it, no human lungs able to give it breath. Some force about the razored melody was ripping and picking at the very air, cutting into the flesh of the reel. The top of the dome rippled like water, warping. Indolently, as if it was something done out of boredom rather than directed cruelty, the woman flicked her wrist and sent coils of shimmering aural force humming away down the lines of the pyramid. The waveforms caught around Pyre Ral and hoisted him off the stone, flipping him over in mid-air. Ash came off him in wreaths, his armour puckering and bending in the wrong places. He released a strangled cry that ended in a crackle of bone as he imploded. The Death Guard's crushed remnants bounced away into the melee below. Garrow snarled in anger at the casual manner of his battle brother's death, charging upward. Then, almost unexpectedly, he made the top, letting his bolter fall away around his hip on its sling. The battle captain brought up Libertas in a firm two-handed grip and laid into the war singer. At his flank he was aware of Decius giving him covering fire, grimacing as the bolt rounds whined away in ricochets from the sheer energy of the wall of music. The war singer turned her notice to Garrow, resentment forming on her face as his attacks invaded her sensorium. He saw her shift and turn, the long streamers of her hair drifting past her screaming face. Holding on to the fury from the cold murder of his subordinate, his sword swept across and connected with her song shield, the noise of the impact like a knife point drawn down a sheet of glass. Effortlessly, the enemy champion drew the sound in and threaded it into her cacophony, weaving it into the mad chorus. In a flash of understanding, the nature of his foe was revealed to him. The war singer could not be brought down by the energy of light and heat. Only raw sound would be enough to kill her. From the terrible mantra filling the dome space, the war singer teased out a single line of screaming clamour and spun it into a fist of glowing resonance. Garrow saw the blow coming and shoved Decius aside, dodging away from her. She moved at the speed of sound, and with a sonic boom, shocking the air into white rings of vapour, the war singer hit Garrow with a hammer made of hymnals. Deafened. Falling. Pain. Decius's mind reeled with the edges of the impact, clinging to the simplest of reactions, barely able to process the sudden violence wrought upon him. The dome spun around, and he felt the rough surface of the ziggurat rise up and strike him as he fell back along the slope of it. Decius's power fist slapped down flat and open-palmed on a jutting piece of aged gargoyle, and the fingers closed around it with a snap. The stone statuary chipped and cracked but held, halting his ignominious descent. His head tolled like a struck bell, a strange, fuzzy pressure crowding in on his eyes. Decius swore a guttural, barbaran oath under his breath and righted himself. His hyper-aware senses told him of contusions and minor breaks in some of his bones, but nothing that would warrant more than passing notice. Garrow. Captain Garrow had saved his life up there, pushing him out to the edge of the Warsinger's attack. Something sparked inside, an anxious flare of emotion that was as close to panic as an Astartes might ever get. Where was he? Where was the battle captain? Decius came to his feet, pleased to find his bolter still at hand, the strap wrapped about his wristguard, and batted away in Istvanian's clumsy attack. He swept the flank of the pyramid and found his commander. Garrow's marble-grey armour was stained with the rich red of Astartes' blood. A warrior of the Emperor's children was standing over him. Tarvitz, he remembered. Garrow had spoken well of this man in the past. Still, a dart of offended pride rose in Decius's chest at the idea of a man from the 3rd Legion coming to the aid of a death guard, honour brother or not. Ignoring the grinding pain of bone on bone in his legs, Decius sprinted back up the ziggurat, regaining some of the ground he had lost in his headlong tumble. He caught a snatch of conversation between the two captains as he came closer. "Hold on, brother," Tarvitz was saying.
"Just kill it,"
Garrow coughed, blood on his lips, his head bare where the Warsinger's blow had sundered his battle helmet. "I have him," said Decius, stepping up. "He'll be safe with me." Tarvitz threw him a nod and then began his ascent. The Astartes turned back to his commander, and his gut knotted as the stink of fresh blood filled his nostrils. The smell was familiar and hateful to him. There were patterns of crushing damage to Garrow's torso and his arm, and somewhere up there he had lost his bolter. But in his other hand, his good hand, the battle captain still gripped the hilt of Libertas with grim fury, clutching the sword like a talisman. Thin blades of shattered granite and obsidian punctured him, shock gel pooling around the places where they had punched through the captain's ceramite weave like bullets. But the worst of the wounds was the leg. Decius's face soured beneath his breath mask, and he was grateful that his commander could not see his expression. Less than a hand's span down Garrow's thigh, his right leg simply ended in a wet, red scrap of fleshy rags, burnt bone and charred meat. It could only be the potent flood of coagulants, neurochemical agents, and counter-shock drugs from his gland implants that were keeping the captain conscious. Contemplating the sheer agony of the wound took Decius's breath away. The Warsinger hadn't simply torn Garrow's leg from its socket. She had sheared it off with a serrated blade of pure sound.
"How do I look, lad?"
asked the captain.
"Not so pretty as the Emperor's children."
"Well, it's not that bad." Garrow spat out a pain-racked chuckle.
"You're such a poor liar, boy."
He waved the Astartes forward.
"Help me up. Saul will finish what we started."
"You're in no condition to fight, Lord," retorted Decius. Garrow dragged himself up to use the Astartes as a crutch.
"Damn you, Decius. As long as a death guard draws breath, he's in a condition to fight."
He cast around, unsteady with the pain.
"Where's my bloody bolter?"
"Lost, sir," Decius noted, guiding him downward. The battle captain spat.
"Terror curse it. Then help me into a sword range, and I'll cut these fools down instead."
Together, leaving a trail of blood down the flank of the ragged pyramid, Decius and Garrow hobbled to the floor of the dome and back into the thronging melee. Decius was aware that above them the Warsinger's song was shifting and changing, but his mind was narrowing to the controlled murder of the close battle at hand. He became his captain's rock, feet spread and standing firm in the royal of combat, gunning down Black Hoods with his bolter in one hand and punishing those who strayed closer with his mailed fist encasing the other. Garrow stood to his back, holding himself up with his damaged arm and cutting shimmering arcs of death with his racing sword. Blood pooled at their feet, the captain's mingling with that of the Istvan turncoats. Decius yelled into his vox pickup for a medicae, but only scratches of static returned to him. The impact from the fall had probably damaged his communications gear, and even at the top of his lungs his shouts could barely match the screaming of the war singer. Finally, Garrow slumped, the Herculean effort and blood loss too much for even his Astartes physiology. Decius helped the battle captain to the ground and propped him against the ziggurat wall. "Sir, take this." He slammed a full clip of ammunition into his bolter and laid it on Garrow's lap.
"Where are you going?"
his commander asked thickly. Garrow was having trouble keeping focus. "I'll be back, Captain." Decius turned and charged into the maelstrom, using the power fist to punch his way through the enemy ranks. Istvanian fighters were thrown and gored as he barreled through them, cutting a channel across the dome through the figures in dark cowls. They moved like water, churning around him and pooling back into the path he made. At last, Decius found what he sought and roared as loud as he could. "Voyen! Hear me!" The Death Guard apothecary's head snapped up from the body of a brother who had been cut apart by laser fire. "I can do no more for this one," he said grimly. "The Emperor knows his name," shouted Decius, "and the captain will join that roll of honour as well unless you come with me now." "Garrow!" Voyen sprung to his feet. "Show me, boy, quickly. The captain of the 7th won't perish if I can help it." They waded back into the morass, fighting and moving. "This way!" "He's still my commander," grated Voyen. "Do you understand that? No matter what is said and done, that will never change. Do you understand, Decius? Who are you trying to convince, Voyen? Me or yourself?" Decius threw him a hard look. "At this moment, I don't care a damn for you and your blasted lodge. Just save—" The rest of the Death Guard's words were lost in a final shrieking exultation of noise from the top of the pyramid. Every man who could clapped his hands to his ears in blind reflex as the war singer sang her last desperate attack and died. Decius looked up and saw two figures in shimmering purple at the peak, saw a torn shape in diaphanous robes fall away and tumble unceremoniously down the steep face. "Eidolon!" cried an Astartes at their side. "Eidolon made the kill! The bitch is dead!" An oval object arced through the air, trailing white streamers, and Decius grabbed it before it could impact on the ground. He turned it over in his hand and found it was a human head. "The war singer," he pronounced, holding it up by the woman's long, pale tresses. The neck had been severed by a single clean blow. With a grimace, he tossed it to the warrior of the Emperor's children and pushed on, ignoring the cries of victory. As one, the surviving Black Hoods stopped fighting. Some had fallen to their knees and were weeping, rocking back and forth or cradling their headsets in their hands, mewing over the sudden loss of their precious song. Most of them just stood there, milling around like lost children, choking the dome with their numbers. "Out of my way! Out of my way, you turncoat cattle!" bellowed Decius, fighting against the moaning crowd. He began punching them down where they stood, cutting the Istvanians like wheat before the scythe. Other Astartes joined in, and soon it became a wholesale cull. The War Master's orders had not spoken of prisoners. By the time they forced their way back to the foot of the ziggurat, Garrow lay before them, deathly pale and silent. An apothecary from the 3rd Legion knelt at his side, frowning. Voyen, his face tight with distress, shot a hard look at the other medicae. "Stand aside! You're not to touch him!"
"I saved his life, Death Guard," came the terse reply. "You should be thanking me. I did your job for you."
Voyen cocked his fist in anger, but Decius stopped him halfway. "Brother," he began, turning to the other man. "Thank you. Will he survive?"
Get him to an infirmary within the hour, and he may live to fight another day.
"Then he will." The young Astartes saluted in the old martial fashion. "I am Decius of the 7th. My company is in your debt." The apothecary gave a slight smile to Voyen and made to leave.
Fabius, apothecary to the Emperor's children, consider my care of your captain a gift among comrades.
Voyen's words dripped venom as the Astartes left. "Arrogant whelp! How dare he—" "Voyen!" snapped Decius, silencing the other man. "Help me carry him!" Garrow was falling forever. The warm void around him was thick and heavy. It was an ocean of thin, clear oil, as deep as memory, and beyond his ability to know its edge. He sank into it, the warmth wrapping around him in gossamer threads, in through his mouth and nostrils, filling his lungs and gullet, weighing him down, down and down, deeper, falling, still falling. He was aware of his injuries in a vague, disconnected way. Parts of his body were blacked out in his sensorium, nerve clusters dark and silent, while the patient engines of his Astartes physiology went to work on keeping him alive.
"My wounds will never heal,"
he said aloud, and the words bubbled past him, solidifying. Why had he said that? Where had that come from? Garrow wondered with elephantine slowness and pushed at the thoughts in his mind, but they were impossible to shift, large as glaciers and ice-cold to the touch. The trance. Part of his brain eventually provided him with this small fragment of data. Yes, of course, his body had closed its borders and sealed him inside it. All other concerns and outside interests forgotten, as his implants worked in concert to stop an encroaching death. The Astartes was in stasis of a kind, not the artificially generated fashion, where flesh was chilled down and chemical anti-crystallization agents were pumped into the bloodstream for long duration, low-consumable starflight. This was a semi-death of the wounded man and the near-killed. Odd how he could be at once so aware of it, and yet so unaware as well. This was the function of the catalepsian node implanted in his brain, switching off sections of his cerebellum as a servitor might douse lamps in the unused rooms of a house. Garrow had been here before, during the Pasiphae uprising, after a suicide attack on the stalwart's pod decks had ripped the flank of the battle barge open and tossed 100 unprotected men into space. He had survived that, awaking with new scars and months of missing time. Would he live through this? Garrow tried to probe his thoughts for an exact recall of his last conscious moments, and found rough, broken perceptions and spikes of brutal pain. Tarvitz. Yes, all Tarvitz had been there, and the lad Decius as well. And before that, there was only the humming echo of white noise and heart-shrinking pain. He let himself drop away, let the agony shadow fade. Would he live through this? Garrow would only know when it happened. Otherwise he would fall and fall, sink and sink, and the captain of the 7th would become another soul lost. A steel, skull-shaped stud the size of his thumbnail hammered into the iron wall of memory on Barbarus. He found he did not have a will to fight. Here, in this non-place, coiled inside himself, he only was. Marking time, waiting, healing. That was how it had been after Pasiphae, and so that was how it should be now. How it should be. But he knew something was different, even as the thought drifted through him. That shattering pain down in the dome, that had been like nothing he had ever experienced before. Hundreds of years of warfare had not prepared him for the war singer's brutal kiss. Garrow knew now, too late, after the fact, that she had been an enemy of a kind he had never before encountered. Where her power sprang from, what form it took, these were things new to him in a universe where the Astartes had thought himself incapable of being surprised. That would teach him not to be complacent. In his own way, the battle captain marvelled at the play of events. It was incredible that he had survived to fall into a healing trance after challenging the war singer. Other Death Guard, other Emperor's children had also met her might and of it. He thought of poor Rahl, crushed like a spent ration can. There would be no more wagers or games for him. As those brothers lay dead, Garrow lived still, clinging to the raw edge of life.
Why? He demanded. Why me and not them? Why Nathaniel Garrow and not Pyral?
Who made the choice? What scales were balanced by a man's death or his life? The questions hooked into him and pulled the Astartes back and forth, burrowing deep. It was such foolishness to ask these pointless things of an uncaring universe. What scales? There were no scales, no great arbiter of fates. It was pagan idolatry to consider such notions, to insist that the lives of men ran in some kind of clockwork beneath the winding fingers of a deity. No. Here was truth. Imperial truth. The stars turned and men died without a creator's plan for them. There were no gods, no herefores and hereafters, no futures but those we made for ourselves. Garrow and his kinsmen simply were. And yet, in this place of death-sleep, where things were at once murky and clearer, there seemed instances where Nathaniel Garrow felt a pressure upon him that came from a place far distant, beyond himself. At the corners of his sensorium, he might perceive a small fragment of brilliance thrown across countless light-years, the merest suggestion of interest from an intellect that towered over his. Cold logic told him that this was wishful, desperate thinking, dredged up from the crude animal core of his hindbrain. But Garrow could not quite let go of the feeling, of the raw hope that the will of something greater than he was acting upon him. If he was not dead, then perhaps he had been spared. It was a giddy, perilous thought.
His hand lies upon all of us, and every one of us owes him our devotion.
Who spoke those words? Was it Garrow or someone else? They seemed strange and new, echoing from a distance.
He guides us, teaches us, exhorts us to become more than we are, said the colourless voice. But most of all, the Emperor protects.
The words disturbed Nathaniel. They made him turn and shift in the thick sea, his comfort fading. He sensed the pressure of dark storms brewing out in the impossible spaces around him, the visions of them coming to his mind through someone else's eyes, through a soul not far from his, yes, bright like the distant watcher, but only a single candle against the greater light's burning sun. Black clouds of churning emotion, seething and pushing at the warp and weft of space, looking for a weak point through which they could flow. The storm front was coming, inexorable, unstoppable. Garrow wanted to turn away, but there was no place in the drifting fall where he did not find them. He wanted to rise up and fight it, but he had no hands, no face, no flesh. There were shapes in the gloomy shifting coils that rose and fell, some resembling the spirals of symbols he had seen inside the dome on Istvan Extremis, Others he had glimpsed on the uncommon banners of the Lupercal's court, and, repeating over and over, a threefold icon that seemed to be seeking him out wherever his attention moved. A triad of skulls, a pyramid of screaming faces, 3 black discs, a trio of bleeding bullet wounds, and other variations, but always the same arrangement of shapes.
"The Emperor protects," said a woman,
and Garrow felt her hands upon his cheek, the salt tang of her fallen tears on his lips. The sensations came to him from far, far away, drawing him to them and out of the haze of the threatening storms. Nathaniel was rising now, faster and faster, the warmth turning chill upon him, the pain coiling around his legs and stomach. There was a woman. A head of short hair framed in a penitent's hood, and agony. Awakening. "Eyes of terror," gasped Caleb. "He's alive! The captain lives!" "I would like to see him," said Temeter stiffly. Sergeant Haker frowned. "Lord, my captain is in no state to—" Temeter silenced him with an upraised hand. "Haker, old blade, out of respect to you for your service and record, I won't consider your obstreperous manner to be discourteous to my rank. But do not mistake what I just said for a request. Get out of my way, Sergeant." Haker gave a shallow bow. "Of course, Captain. I forget myself." Temeter stepped around the veteran and strode purposefully into the Endurance's tertiary infirmary, throwing nods to men from his own company who were still healing from wounds taken on the Yorgul world-ship. Most would not return to combat status, but would suffer the comparative ignominy of becoming permanently stationed as ship crew, or else return to Barbarous to live out their days as commandant instructors to the novitiates. Ulys Temeter hoped that Garrow would not share such a fate. The day that the battle captain was forced to step off the battle line would be the day the man's spirit perished. He entered a cordoned-off Medicae cell and found his comrade there in a support throne, surrounded by brass technologies and glass jars of fluids, piping gently into the sockets of Garrow's implanted carapace. The battle captain's housecarl jumped as Temeter swept in and came to his feet in a jerk of shocked motion. Caleb clutched a fist of inky papers to his chest and blinked with watery eyes. Temeter immediately had the sense that he had caught the serf doing something wrong, but he decided not to press the matter. "Has he said anything?" Caleb nodded, tucking the papers into an inner pocket in his tunic. "Yes, sir. While the captain was healing, he spoke several times. I couldn't divine the meaning of it all, but I heard him speak names, the Emperor's chief among them." The housecarl was anxious. "He has not been in contact with anyone else beyond the Medicae staff and myself since his healing coma concluded." Temeter looked at Garrow and leaned closer. "Nathaniel? Nathaniel, you old fool! If you're done sleeping, there's a crusade on, or haven't you noticed?" He kept a note of good humour, masking his own concern. His smile became genuine when Garrow's eyes fluttered open and fixed on him.
"Ulys, can't you handle a fight without me?"
"Ha!" said Temeter. "Your wounds haven't dulled that wit of yours, then." He laid a hand on Garrow's shoulder. "Word from that peacock, Saul Tarvitz. He's back on the Andronius, but he wanted to thank you for softening up the war singer for him." The captain grunted in amusement, but said nothing. "Your lads were concerned," Temeter continued. "I hear Haker was afraid he might have to step up and take the Eagle Cuirass."
"I can still carry it, if only these sawbones would let me go."
Garrow winced as a wave of pain shot through him.
"I heal better standing up."
Temeter shot a lookout into the infirmary proper, where Voyen hovered silently. He took a breath. "How's the leg, Nathaniel?" Garrow's face went a little grey as he looked down the chair. His right limb was misshapen and out of place. Instead of a form of strong, firm muscle and sinew, there was a skeletal construct of dense steel and plates made of polished brass that mimicked the planes of a thigh and calf. The augmetic leg was of excellent quality, but it was no less shocking to see it there. Conflicting thoughts warred over Garrow's expression.
It will suffice. The chirurgeons tell me that the nerve bonding went without incident. According to Brother Voyen, in time I will not even be aware of it.
Temeter heard the thinly veiled disbelief in his comrade's voice, but chose not to respond to it.
Well, that's the battle captain I know. What other man can leave a good cut of himself on the field and still come back for a rematch with teeth bared?
Garrow gave a wan smile, his voice strengthening.
Oh, I hope that will be soon. Tell me, brother, what have I missed while I was healing? Did I sleep through Istvan's pacification and the rest of the Great Crusade?
Hardly.
Temeter worked at keeping a light tone, even as he saw where Nathaniel was taking the conversation.
Orders from the War Master have come down from Lord Mortarion. The fleet's at high anchor over Istvan III as we speak. All the turncoats' local orbitals have been taken down by the Raven squadrons, and what system ships we encountered are wreckage. The skies belong to Horus.
And the attack on the Coral City? If you are here, then I assume it's still to come.
Soon, brother. The War Master himself has chosen the men who will form the spear tip against Vardis Pral's forces.
Garrow frowned slightly.
Horus is picking the units. That is atypical. Well, that's usually a task for the Legion Master.
Well, he is the War Master, Temeter replied with a hint of pride. Atypical is his prerogative.
Garrow nodded.
He chose your units, didn't he? No wonder you're so happy about it.
The captain smiled.
I look forward to fighting alongside you again so soon after the Yorgul assault.
And there it was. As much as Temeter didn't want to show a reaction, he knew he did, and he saw that Nathaniel caught it. The ends of Garrow's smile tightened.
Or not.
Nathaniel, he sighed. I thought I should be the one to tell you before that dolt Grolgor made sport of it. The apothecaries have not declared you fully healed, and therefore you are deemed unfit for battlefield operations. Your command remains at a limited duty standing.
Limited?
Garrow bit out the word and shot a savage, angry glare at Voyen, who hurriedly turned and walked away.
Is that how I am considered? As limited?
Don't be petulant, snapped Temeter, heading off his friend's anger as quickly as he could.
And don't take it out on Voyen. He's only doing his duty to the Legion and to you. If you tried to lead the 7th Company now, you'd risk failing them, and that's a chance the Death Guard can't take. You're not going down to Istvan III, Nathaniel. Those orders come direct from First Captain Typhon.
Callous Typhon can kiss my sword hilt,
growled Garrow, and Temeter saw his housecarl blink in shock at the normally stoic captain's insult.
Get this cage of ornaments off me,
he continued, forcing away the Medicae monitors and filter vials.
Nathaniel, wait!
With a grunt of effort, Garrow shoved himself off the support throne and onto his flesh and metal feet. He took a few firm steps forward.
If I can move, then I can fight. I'll go to Typhon and tell him that in person.
Garrow pushed away and paced out of the cell, fighting off a hobble in his walk with each angry step. Caleb watched his master rise from his sickbed and stride away, the steel and brass of his new limb as much a part of him as his iron will to survive. Alone again for a moment in the small chamber, he pulled out the sheaf of papers tucked in his pocket and spread them smooth on the rough matting of the support throne. With furtive care, from a chain around his neck, the housecarl drew a small metal fetish, carved out of a bolt shell case. It was a rudimentary thing, rough in form, but cut with the sort of care that only devotion could bring. Held to the light, Thin lines of etching and patterns of pinholes showed the outline of a towering figure haloed by rays from a sun. Caleb put the small icon down on the top of the papers and ran his palms over one another. Now he was convinced, as ridiculous as the idea was that he might have required further proof for his faith. As his honoured master had dallied between death and life there before him, Caleb had stood sentinel over Captain Garrow and read in hushed whispers the words that traced across the dog-eared leaflets. "His hand lies upon all of us, and every one of us owes him our devotion. He guides us, teaches us, and exhorts us to become more than we are. But most of all, the Emperor protects." Indeed, the Emperor had protected Nathaniel Garrow. He had answered Caleb's entreaty to save the life of his master, and shown the Death Guard the way back from the brink. Now the housecarl fully understood what he had only suspected before. Garrow is of purpose. The Astartes lived, not through chance or caprice of action, but because the Lord of mankind wished it to be so. There would come a moment, and the housecarl instinctively knew it would be soon, when Garrow would be set to a task that only he could fulfill. When that time came, Caleb's role would be to light the man's way. Caleb knew that to speak of this to his master would be wrong. He had kept his quiet beliefs to himself for this long, and the moment was not yet right to speak openly of them. But he could see it. He was sure that Garrow was gradually turning to the same path that he already walked, a path that led to terror, and to the only truly divine being in the cosmos, the God Emperor himself. When he was sure he was not being observed, the housecarl began to pray, his hands spread wide across the pages of the Lectitio Divinitatus, the words of the Church of the Holy Emperor. Garrow's face was hard with chained anger, and he felt it surge each time the new leg made him limp. The minute gyroscopic mechanisms in the limb would take time to learn the motions and kinetics of his body movement, and until they did, he would be forced to walk as if lame. Still, he reflected, at least he could walk. The ignominy of relying on a cane or some other support would have been difficult to bear. Temeter kept pace with him. The captain of the Fourth had given up trying to convince him to return to the infirmary, and followed warily at his side. The uncertainty on Temeter's face was clear. Garrow's battle-brother had not seen him in such a foul humour before. They reached the Endurance's commandery, the nexus of private chambers and sanctorum their Primarch took as his own while he was aboard, crossing the small atrium to the entrance. Garrow saw another Death Guard walking in front of him, intent on the same destination, and to his concern he realized it was Ignatius Grulgor. The commander of the second company turned at the sound of a steel foot on the marble tiles of the floor and gave Garrow a disdainful, appraising look.
"Not dead, then?"
Grulgor folded his arms and looked down his nose. He was still wearing his war gear, where Garrow had only simple duty robes.
"I hope that's not too great a disappointment to you," Garrow retorted.
"Nothing could be further from the truth," lied the commander. "But tell me, in your invalid state, would it not be safer for you to keep to your sick bed? In such a weakened condition—"
"Oh, for once in your life be silent!" snapped Temeter. Grulgor's face darkened.
"Watch your mouth, Captain."
Garrow waved the other Astartes away.
"I don't have time to spar with you, Grulgor. I will have the Primarch's ear."
He continued on towards the doors.
"You're too late for that," came the reply. "Not that the Death Lord would have deigned to spare his attention to a cripple. Mortarion is no longer aboard the Endurance. He's with the War Master once again, in conference on matters of the Crusade."
"Then I'll talk to Typhon."
Grulgor sneered.
"You can wait your turn. He summoned me here only moments ago."
"We'll see who waits," snapped Garrow,
and slammed the commandery doors wide open. Inside, first Captain Typhon's head jerked up from the battle maps laid out on the chart table before him. Typhon's hulking armoured form was framed by a tall stained-glass window that looked out over the length of the warship's dorsal hull.
Garrow!
He seemed genuinely surprised to see the battle captain up and walking.
Sir, replied Nathaniel, Captain Temeter informs me that my combatant status has not been restored.
Typhon gave Grolgor a slight sign with his hand, a command to wait.
This is so? The apothecaries say—
I care little for that at this moment, Garrow broke in, ignoring protocol.
I request my command squad be immediately tasked to the Isfan 3 assault.
A quick, almost imperceptible look passed between Typhon and Grolgor before the first captain spoke again.
Captain Temeter, why are you here?
Temeter hesitated, wrong-footed by the question. Lord, I came with Captain Garrow in, support. Typhon gestured to Garrow with a wave of his hand.
Does he need support, Temeter? He can stand on his own 2 feet.
He gave a sharp nod at the commandery doors.
You are dismissed. Attend to your company and the preparations for the drop.
The captain of the 4th frowned and saluted, giving Garrow a last look before he exited the chamber. When the doors banged shut, Nathaniel met Typhon's gaze again.
I'll have an answer from you, First Captain. Your request is denied.
Why? Garrow demanded.
I am fit to lead. Damn it, I stood and fought on Isfan Extremis with a leg torn from me, and yet I cannot prosecute the Emperor's enemies with this tin prosthesis bolted to my torso.
Typhon's hard amber eyes narrowed.
If it were up to me, I would let you do this, Garrow. I would be willing to let you stumble into that war zone and live or die on your own stock of bravado. But the word comes from his lordship. Mortarion makes this command, Captain. Would you oppose the will of our Primarch? Well, if he were here in this chamber, I would. Then you would hear the same words from his lips. If time enough had passed and your injury was fully healed, then perhaps. But not here and now.
Grolgor couldn't resist the opportunity to twist the knife.
I'll bring a little glory back for you, Terran.
Garrow's ire rose in a hot surge, but Typhon's gruff voice snapped out again before he could speak.
No, Captain Grolgor, you will not. It is my decision that you will also remain with the orbital flotilla during the Istvan 3 operation.
The commander's arrogant bluster died in his throat.
What? Why, Lord? Garrow, he is injured, but I am at battle-ready strength, and—
Typhon spoke over him.
I called you here to give you this order personally, before I departed to board the Terminus Est. I was going to send a runner to Captain Garrow with his orders, but as he has presented himself here before me, I see no reason why I shouldn't inform both of you together.
The first captain stepped around the chart table towards them and took on a formal, commanding tone.
Based on the battle plans of His Excellence, the War Master Horus, and our liege, the Death Lord Mortarion, it has been determined that you will both be assigned to duty stations with your command squads aboard an Imperial warship. And this will be a supervisory posting. The rest of your great companies will remain in reserve. During the assault on Istvan 3 and the Coral City, you will provide standby tactical support for the drop pod deployment operation, and remain on alert to perform rapid reaction interdict duties.
A servitor approached Garrow and handed him a data slate containing the details of the official battle edict.
Interdiction against what? Demanded Grolgor. Prowl's army has nothing that flies. We destroyed it all.
Which of us will have operational command?
Asked Garrow in a low, resigned voice, paging through the content of the slate.
That responsibility will be shared jointly, Typhon replied.
On some level, Garrow felt defeated and empty, but at least he could draw small consolation from the fact that he would not have to face Grolgor lauding his superiority over the men of his command squad. In an instant, The burning discontentment that had flooded through him cooled and faded. Garrow's old usual manner of dogged endurance came easily back to the fore. If Mortarion said it was to be so, then in all truth, what right did he have to say otherwise? He hid a sigh.
"Thank you, First Captain, for illuminating me. At your discretion, I wish to assemble my men and brief them on this new task."
Typhon nodded.
"You are dismissed, Captain Garrow."
Nathaniel Garrow turned and walked away, the clicking of the steel foot a ticking metronome for his discontent. Grulgor made to leave as well, but Typhon shook his head.
"Ignatius, a moment."
When Garrow had left the chamber, he stepped closer to the commander.
"I know you feel that I have slighted you, brother, but believe me, the reverse is so."
"Indeed?"
Grulgor was unconvinced.
"The key battle of this campaign, and you tell me I must watch it from orbit. Corralled in a tin can with a gang of swabs, and Garrow playing the wounded martyr. Please, my esteemed First Captain, tell me how this thing does me such great honor."
Typhon ignored the sarcasm.
"I spoke to you before of our master's desire to bring Garrow to the War Master's banner over terrors. But we both know that Garrow will not change. He's too much the Emperor's dutiful warrior."
Grulgor's brow furrowed.
"Istvan III? Could this be the turning point?"
Typhon said nothing, watching him.
"Perhaps."
He nodded slowly, forming his thoughts.
"I think I see an intention emerging. The unusual pattern of mission assignments to specific units from the legions, instead of complete companies. One could imagine that the Lord Horus seeks to isolate the elements that do not share his convictions."
Typhon nodded.
"When the turning point, as you call it, arrives, there are certain duties Horus would have you perform."
His voice dropped.
"Despite Mortarion's munificence and lenience towards him, I know Garrow will attempt to betray our liege lord and the War Master."
Grulgor nodded in return, for the first time exactly aware of his position in the scheme of things.
"I will not allow that to transpire."
Garrow stood in the centre of the armoury chamber and repeated Typhon's words. He forced away the chill impression of storm clouds and building threat, the sense of vast and silent machinations thundering unseen above him. Garrow put these things aside and spoke to his men as their brother and commander, preparing them for the battle to come. There were grumblings of dissension, but Haker stamped on them immediately, and in good order the assembled squads of Astartes began their arming procedures prior to embarkation to their new posting.
"This ship, sir," said Sendek, "the vessel where we're to be sent, do you know anything of it?" "A frigate," replied Garrow. "It's called the Eisenstein."
Chapter 7. It was the honour of the Death Guard that they be the first Astartes to set foot on the surface of Istvan III, in the mission to restore the world to compliance. Ulis Temeter's heart swelled with martial pride to know that he and the men of his company would form the very point of the spear tip. The captain's drop pod hammered into the compacted mudflats adjoining the Coral City's trench lines with a solid thunder of torn earth. The concussion of the landing echoed over and over as hundreds more pods rained from the sky in burning red-orange streaks, half burying themselves in the dirt. The invasion force numbered in the thousands, with warriors of every rank and stripe coming in hard, cold fury to the surface. In the minds of each Astartes there was anger and censure for the rebels, and the Death Guard were but a part of the multiple brigades of warriors and war machines turned to that purpose. The flanks of Temeter's pod flew open, propelled by explosive bolts, and he took his first breath of Istvanian air to call out to his men, "For Terra and Mortarion!" The captain led his command squad out of the shallow crater their landing had created and opened fire, laying down a chattering fan of tracer against a group of turncoat soldiers who had ventured close to observe.